Dear friends, and my honored guest, on behalf of the Board of National Council of Jewish Women of Canada, Toronto, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our event this evening, The Inverted Temple, Jewish Chaplaincy in the Canadian Federal Prison System. My name is Eva Karpati, and I'm honored to be the president of this tremendous organization. I am going to start with a few housekeeping tips and items that I want to cover. First of all, as an attendee, you will unfortunately not be able to be seen or heard by others, including us on the panel. And though I feel your energy out there already, your chat will not be on it either. The poll has come up, and we really appreciate you answering those. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a Q&A, and you may type your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon, which is at the bottom of your screen, and Chaplain Orev will do her best to answer as many of those questions as possible. The session is about an hour, and half an hour will be left for questions. And in true transparency, we're not professional Zoom technicians. However, we're so lucky that our board member, Bonnie Wells, is our own Zoom expert. But if there are any glitches, please bear with us. So really appreciate Bonnie being here to help in case we need.
I've been told that there might be a problem with the poll and that you can't answer you can't answer 2 out of the 3 questions. So don't worry about it, ladies. It's not that important. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Glitch number 1, easy. I would like to start this evening by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Now, there might be a few of you present this evening that are really not aware about this awesome organization. So bear with me as I give you a tiny little glimpse into us, because we are actually 123 years old, and that puts us as the oldest Jewish volunteer women's organization in Canada. And in all that time, we've stayed true to our mandate of engaging and impacting the community through relevant and meaningful programs that provide education, service, and social impact. And just a brief glimpse into the breadth of our program, I just wanted to share a few of those programs. We started off in 1897 by actually helping new immigrant women integrate into Canada. So right as they were coming off the trains, we were already there welcoming them. And we were especially cognizant of young women who were coming by themselves, and certainly a precursor to our work in the area of human trafficking. Moving well forward in the 60s, we became a first center for senior citizens, and that became so successful that it became the renowned, now the Bernard Battelle Center for Creative Living. 16 years ago, we launched our Just for Me backpack project to benefit children who otherwise would not be able to afford school supplies. And I'm proud to say that we continue that today as the need is still prevalent. And also through our profound education and advocacy, we were able to get the City of Toronto to proclaim May 10th as Human Trafficking Awareness Day. We have 2 new projects, our Project Lisa and our One Voice, which now addresses the issue of domestic violence and violence against against women, respectively. So you can see we've got a wide selection of programs addressing the needs in the community. I actually met Chaplain Orev Katz 2 years ago during our most impactful and significant program, our Passover food drive. And this program takes place 2 weeks prior to the holiday, and we engage the community to pack and deliver close to 2,000 boxes of kosher for Passover food to those in need in our community. When I met Orev, I was fascinated by her work and realized that in fact our community has so many faces, and some of those faces stay invisible to us. I have to admit, I was also really taken by the fact that this diminutive, gentle woman counsels incarcerated men. Lot of thought and a lot of preconceived notions going on there for me. We connected again this year, though our drive was certainly very different. And this time we determined that we were going to see how our diverse work can intersect. So I'm so thrilled that Chaplain Katz has agreed to be our first guest in our speaker series. To introduce Chaplain Orev Rina Katz, I'd like to say that Orev Rina Katz HaKohenet practices spiritual care with people who are incarcerated in the federal prisons of Southern Ontario, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Mohawk, Ottawa, and Mississaugas of New Credit in Williams, Treaty 57 and 13 territories. Orev is the Jewish chaplain at Collins Bay, Joyceville, and Beaver Creek institutions, where she provides progressive, social justice-based Jewish education and one-on-one counseling. Orev is also the spiritual care provider for 2 frontline staff teams at the Prison AIDS HIV Support and Action Network, PASAN. Chaplain Orev's work in the prisons involves journeying with incarcerated people through restorative and transformative justice to find meaning, hope, and accountability. She works with people in all security levels and designations, including those diagnosed with a range of mental health, addiction, and aging issues. Like all incarcerated people, Orev's clients struggle with grief, addiction, suicidality, and intergenerational trauma. Orev's experience and understanding of Judaism has been deeply transformed in community with Jews of color, poor and marginalized Jews who happen to be incarcerated. She has also deepened her relationship to observant Jews and their experiences of faith and tradition. In addition to her frontline and support work, Orev is the Ontario rep for her union, Steelworkers Local 1976, representing National Federal Correctional Chaplains. She's also the chair of the Correctional Chaplaincy Community of Practice with the Canadian Association of Spiritual Care. During this current COVID crisis, Orev has been providing additional support to PASAN staff through online group and one-on-one sessions. Because the federal correctional chaplains have been shut out of the prison since March 18th, Orev and her colleagues have been organizing to put pressure on the National Chaplaincy Office to find creative solutions to the lack of service using technology available in every prison. Orev has also been volunteering with other grassroots decarceration organizations such as Think Twice and supporting the movement for Black Lives in various ways. Orev was born in Guelph, raised in Toronto, and lived in Barcelona, Haida Gwaun, New York, and Gatineau before returning to Toronto. And with no further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Chaplain Orev Katz. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to do my best, as we all are in these new pandemic times, to look at you and to engage you. I'm going to move my laptop back a little bit here. I really so appreciated hearing your words about how we met and when we met, and I hope you realize that for me to meet you as part of the Passover food drive was so uplifting. I have had very little positive interactions and feedback from Jewish community organizations in terms of supporting our incarcerated communities. So it just filled my heart to have such a connecting conversation with you. And since then, our ongoing relationship has been very positive. And I know the folks that I work with on the inside feel it too. As you can imagine, the Pesach food that they get is kosher for Pesach, but it's extremely minimal. So to receive some of the items from the drive, both last year and this year, was just extremely helpful for them, especially this year during COVID. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen with everyone. And before I go into my presentation, I would love to know who out there has had an experience either visiting or being inside of a Canadian prison. We're going to throw a poll up again. It's just a yes or no. It always helps me know who I'm speaking with. So if you have a moment to fill that in, it doesn't have to be a federal prison. It could be a provincial prison if you know the difference between the two. If you grew up in Toronto, the Don Jail would also have been a prison that many people did visit if they were living here. So as we're collecting that data, I wanted to share just a little bit about what it means to be a Kohenet. I get asked that question all the time. I'm not a rabbi, but I'm actually an ordained Hebrew priestess. Kohenet is an institute started by a rabbi named Jill Hammer in the US. She lives in New York, and it's a Jewish Renewal Institute that comes out of the Isabella Friedman Center in Connecticut. Our ordination process is 3 years long, and her rabbinical thesis was focused on women's roles in the temple. So we're very oriented towards earth-based practices. We do everything that rabbinic students do except for officiating marriages. That's the one part of our ordination process that Kohanot are not a part of. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that. There's a website that you can Google, just look up kohenet.org. And here we're seeing the polls. So 22% are saying yes, which is awesome. I actually got a much lower percent, and 78 are saying no. So it's really important for me to invite you to share from your own experience. When we do get to the Q&A, I would love to know what you experienced when you were visiting or inside a prison. So as Eva so generously said, I do work at 3 different federal prisons, and that's actually 7 institutions because they have different security levels within the prison as a whole. And I was going to start my presentation by just sharing some images of the prisons. I do call them inverted temples, and the reason why I use this phrase to discuss prisons is because our temple was a sacred space, a space where many people were active and doing service work. And of course, the Holy of Holies, where the priest entered once a year on behalf of the community, was a very small area in which they connected directly with the divine. And in my work in incarcerated communities, what I've found is that living in a cell, the isolation of that experience, and the truth and honesty of reflection that it requires is very similar to that Holy of Holies. And all the different roles and tasks for everything from chaplains to food services to mental health and libraries, all of those pieces are like part of the temple courtyard. So it's inverted because incarcerated people are extremely isolated in our society. They're kept out, they're pushed out. And in many communities, not just the Jewish community, there's a lot of shame associated with having been incarcerated. So that inversion is something that I hope my work does to turn over. So we'll start with looking at some of the federal prisons in Southern Ontario. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to provide spiritual care. For those of you who don't know, spiritual care is kind of the new name, the name that most people use now for chaplaincy. Chaplaincy comes from a very Christian tradition, and over the last 20 years, the field has become much more inclusive of all faiths and no faith, atheism, any faith tradition that exists here, and also indigenous spiritual practices, and of course agnosticism. So the third section of my presentation will look at specifically how Judaism is practiced and what I use in my counseling and teaching practices from our tradition to kind of uplift and help processes mostly of teshuvah, of repair. And finally, we're going to look at some of the really interesting and juicy proposals that our sacred texts like Torah have to offer as alternatives to incarceration. You may know already that there aren't any prisons in the Torah except for the one that Joseph is incarcerated in Egypt. And there are a few different proposals, what I would call restorative justice proposals, for how we deal in community when harm has been caused. Of course, let's be real, there's also a lot of really harmful, in Leviticus especially, really harmful punishments doled out for causing harm. So we'll be discussing all of those things in the fourth section. So to begin, I'm just going to quickly go through the 8 prisons that we have here in Southern Ontario, 7 prisons that we have here in Southern Ontario. And I'm going to point out a couple things about them as institutions. Feel free to read the stats at the bottom. Bath Institution is unique in that it is designated right now as the LGBT-focused prison. So if there are LGBT folks who self-identify upon entering the federal system, they will most likely be sent to Bath Institution. I have a little artwork. I'm not sure if you all can see that depending on where our faces are. But this is a painting done of Bath by a formerly incarcerated artist there, so I included that. Beaver Creek is in Muskoka. It's in cottage country, and it's unique in that the minimum side of Beaver Creek, the minimum security level, is designed to be much more residential based. It almost looks like a camp or a university campus. On the right, you see the medium side, which is much more traditional looking prison with the barbed wire and the gates. But Beaver Creek is actually open. There's no fences, and that was very intentional. It was experimental at the time, and now we have a number of federal prisons who follow that design. Collins Bay is right in Kingston itself. It is extremely traditional looking as a prison, as you can see in this image. If you're familiar with Kingston, it's right on Bath Road in the west of the city, and very accessible, very urban. All 4 security designations exist at Collins Bay. So there's a minimum, a medium, a maximum, and what's now called an SIU. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the acronym. It used to be segregation, and due to the court cases around a number of suicides that had happened in segregation, the legislation around those units changed, and they're now called SIUs, and there's a bunch of different regulations that sort of prevent the degree of isolation that was occurring in segregation. Grand Valley Institution is our federal women's institution in Ontario, and it replaced the prison for women, which had a number of riots in the mid-90s. Grand Valley is also unique and experimental in the sense that there are some cottages there in which women who are incarcerated can live with their kids if they choose to. It's also a much more open campus in which they can move from building to building. Another thing, a quick thing about Grand Valley is that although there are likely 2 Jewish women incarcerated there, according to the data that I last looked up on our system, I have not been to Grand Valley as a Jewish chaplain due to some of the regulations about how chaplaincy happens for faith communities. So just to be really brief about it, there's a formula that's developed based on data that's collected at the entrance to an institution. And when there is enough, sort of a critical mass of people from a single faith, the federal system will reach out through the regional chaplain to the chaplains of various faiths. So 2 is not considered enough. And this is actually truly a violation of their charter rights, because regardless of how many other people of your faith tradition are incarcerated at the time you are, you're still supposed to be able to have full access to visiting your chaplain and to practicing your faith. Joyceville is just northeast of Kingston, and it's what's called the assessment unit, meaning anyone who receives a conviction of 2 years less a day or more will be incarcerated there first. Their security level will be assessed, and for about 3 months they will go through a process of essentially becoming part of the prison system. Their statistics will be recorded. They'll receive a parole officer. As I said, their security unit will be recorded, and there'll be a kind of what's called a correctional plan developed for them. So Joyceville is a very intense prison. There's a lot of languishing. There is much less of a sense of empowerment or ability to find one's ground, and it's really like a holding tank until people get sent to the various institutions that are ironically called their mother institutions. Millhaven is our highest security institution. This image looks really daunting and horrible. I mean, it is in many ways the highest security. So you can see in this image the double fencing and the sort of panopticon style security tower. Some of their most violent offenders are incarcerated at Millhaven. But it's also a place where there's a lot of focus on mental health. Millhaven and Bath both have treatment centers. They're called regional treatment centers, in which a clinical environment is provided for the inmates. And for 18 months, I had the amazing honor of doing multi-faith spiritual care at those RTCs. So that's more like a psychiatric unit, very, very high risk. Inmates who are all struggling with self-harm and suicidality, many of whom are Indigenous and racialized, very intense, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the sort of specifics of incarceration when a person is also struggling with severe mental health issues. Of course, in most of our opinions as correctional chaplains, to be incarcerated creates mental health issues, and no one who's incarcerated isn't feeling some sense of anxiety and depression. But of course, for the most powerful and potent cases, they are actually housed in a completely different unit and treated in clinical ways. So that's Millhaven and the RTCs. And Warkworth is close to Peterborough. It's a large open site, and it was originally built just to house sexual offenders. And in the early 80s, that was changed. Sexual offenders are now integrated in prison populations, and there's a number of very specific programs that they are required and invited to take. There's a wonderful organization that's across the country called COSA, Circles of Support and Accountability, which works with sexual offenders who want to reform their behavior, creates a circle, literally, around a person after they're released from prison, in which they're accountable to three other, usually men, three other people of their gender, around their crime, around their victims, around restitution, and any emotions or behaviors that come up for them. I'm happy to talk more about that when we talk about restorative justice, but it's a very powerful program that has, I think, a 2% recidivism rate. It's really strong. That's Circles of Support and Accountability, COSA. So we are going to do questions at the end, but if you have any questions about those prisons, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and I will do my best to address all the questions at the end of the presentation. So, Tehom el Tehom Koreh, from the deep I call to you. This is how I feel about the honor and the challenge of doing spiritual care and chaplaincy in our prison system. It is often a place of profound isolation and profound friendship, camaraderie, and deep relationship building. Prisons are environments in which people who haven't experienced them don't understand them, and they're spaces where people often experience hitting rock bottom. And this can be an opening or a crack to finding hope, finding faith, finding meaning, and finding change within relationship, especially when one has experienced harm and caused harm, which is, of course, what we call the cycle of violence. If you're familiar with the work of Father Greg Boyle, he's one of my heroes. Also a chaplain, also clergy, and the founder of Homeboy Bakery and Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. Father Boyle essentially works with almost exclusively racialized men, Black and Latinx men, who have been brought into the gang culture as a survival tool, as a way of getting through poverty and racism. And he has built a company in which it's a collectively owned company in which people make bread and pastries, and now they're doing t-shirts and sweatshirts. He's written a couple books, and this quote from him really inspires me. We are looking in awe of what people have survived rather than in judgment of their behavior. And this is the way that I approach my work in the prison system. So what is spiritual care? What is chaplaincy? We act as non-judgmental witnesses, meeting our clients in the present moment. Often we don't even know what their crime was. If they disclose it to us, that becomes part of the work that we do together. But we hold true to the experience of relationship, of meeting someone one-on-one, acknowledging that harm has been done and that we have also enacted harm. We also work very hard to build a relationship with them that is based on respect and accountability, as a model for perhaps the only relationship in their life that might look like that, or many relationships that they want to improve, change, and become accountable within. As a woman chaplain, I also do find it very nourishing and fulfilling to talk about gender with my clients, to talk to them about any comments or behaviors that I might find push my boundaries. And I often get asked the question if anyone's ever been inappropriate with me in the system, and honestly, it's never happened in my 6 years of being in prisons, not only here but in the States. I've had a really incredible kind of stereotype smashing experience personally, working with men on the inside. There's a deep sense of reflection. And of course, the men that I work with are coming already to chapel. So they're a different category of men who are just hanging out and trying to do their time and survive and get through. But it is something that's been an amazing learning for me to be able to talk about gender, to be able to talk about domestic violence and violence against women with folks who are sometimes convicted of crimes against women. I also work from a trauma-informed harm reduction framework, which means that I'm sitting across from my client in the assumption that they too are trauma survivors. So often when violence is enacted, almost all the time, it's because it's coming from a place where violence was experienced. So that's essentially how we approach any moment with a client, but that's the trauma-informed lens. And harm reduction is really a sense of when we're working with substance use, people have survived addiction, people are currently addicted. There is a sense of non-judgment and recovery being what they want it to be. Of course, incarceration involves a lot of illegal substances on the inside as it does on the outside. People have their struggles with addiction, and they also have their struggles with getting over their addiction. And meeting my approach, and I wouldn't say this is across the board for correctional chaplains, but my approach is to meet someone as they show up and to work with who they are in the moment. There are a wide variety of approaches to spiritual care and to correctional chaplaincy. I myself am trained as a psychotherapist, so I come from a spiritually informed psychotherapy lens. And if you are a therapist yourself, or if you're interested in psychotherapy, you might recognize some of these modalities that I engage. So narrative therapy, solution-focused therapy, family systems, and also some somatic treatments such as sensory motor and somatic experiencing. Dialectical behavioral therapy is a system that was invented by a woman who struggled deeply with depression and anxiety and was profoundly spiritual. So she came up with a number of worksheets and proposals and exercises for people who are struggling on the edge of depression and anxiety and want to include their spiritual practices in their recovery and their healing. So I often work with DBT as well. As I said earlier, we are now working in a much different milieu than even 20 years ago, and chaplaincy or spiritual care in the prison system is very interfaith and intersectional. So I approach my workplaces by introducing myself always to the Aboriginal community there, whether it's the liaison officers or the elders. I like to get to know their assessments if they've had one in the prison system. And if you're curious about what that means, I can share more about that later. I have a wonderful language exchange with an Ojibwe client at Beaver Creek. For some reason, he's interested in Yiddish. He's really a polyglot. He loves language, and he's a writer. So we meet and do a little Ojibwe Yiddish exchange. And I also try to tailor my materials to the experiences of the Jews that I'm meeting. Just as throughout our lives as Jews, we meet all kinds of Jews, there's such a wide variety on the inside, and I really enjoy getting to know how people reach their Judaism, what it means to them, what brought them to want to practice it on the inside, and who in the Jewish community is supporting them as they are incarcerated. And as I was mentioning earlier, discussing things like masculinity and sexuality is a really important part of what I bring to my counseling. There's a lot of shame dished out to men who are incarcerated, particularly men who are incarcerated for crimes related to sexual offenses or violence against women. And it's really important for me to start the healing process. I'm a survivor myself, and so this work for me has many layers and many modalities of healing, and that's one of them. I think I'm going to go to the next slide here. This is a quote from Angela Davis. Right now, as we all know, there are so many conversations going on around reducing funding to police, abolition, whether or not our prison system is actually appropriate, the kind of racism and colonization that it reflects and represents. And Angela Davis has been an abolitionist since the 60s when she herself was incarcerated as a Black Panther. And she says prisons do not disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages. And I really have experienced, particularly in the regional treatment centers that I was discussing earlier, the clinical treatment environments, that there is a sense of caging human beings. And though we have many models in the Canadian federal system for prisons that look more like housing, in the units that are high security and very old, the buildings are old, there is absolutely a sense of disappearing human beings. And this has been one of my greatest learnings, and also the parts of my work that I find the most sacred, to break through that sense of cage, that sense of isolation, to look people in the eye, to speak to them with respect. And certainly at the RTCs, more than once, I've had correctional officers observing my behavior with incarcerated people and telling me that they've learned something from it. So that piece of dehumanizing people who have done wrong, people who are traumatized, people who have caused harm because they've been harmed, is a conversation that I think is so important to have, and that we do have many tools in Judaism to kind of take apart some of the assumptions that we're just sort of raised to believe are true about incarcerated people. So really, the concepts of restorative and transformative justice come from that. They come from the notion that good and bad are dualities that don't serve us as human beings, that all of us have caused harm, that all of us have experienced harm. And in the federal system, there are a few different mechanisms for incarcerated people to access restorative justice. Restorative justice as a concept comes from Indigenous community. Various Indigenous communities have something called circles, in which traditionally, if someone caused harm in the community, they would come to the circle and share what was going on for them, why they did it, and the people that it impacted would do the same. This was then sort of taken by the federal justice system and implemented for Indigenous folks who are incarcerated. There's a stream that they can access through various means before they're incarcerated, but also on the inside, they can go through a process in which they access either their victims or their victims' families. Sometimes it's a letter writing process, sometimes it involves some video conferencing. But in addition to that, there's something called Restorative Justice Week, in which all of the prisons in Southern Ontario contribute to raising awareness about alternative forms of rehabilitation rather than punishment. That first bullet point there, Prisoners' Justice Day, is a day that happens annually, August 10th, that honors the death of people who have been incarcerated and died while incarcerated. It was started in the mid-70s after 2 suicides in a prison in the West Coast, and it's actually enacted by incarcerated people and spread or disseminated by incarcerated people. So it's a fast day, actually, and almost all incarcerated folks on August 10th will either fast or acknowledge Prisoners' Justice Day in some way. And often the chapels will do memorial services. I had a wonderful experience at Beaver Creek one year, co-designing a Prisoners' Justice Day service in which we worked with the elder, some of the Indigenous folks, and the multi-faith community of the chapel to do a ceremony writing names and putting them into a basket of all the people that the guys who were present had seen, had witnessed either dying or having committed suicide or having some chronic illness that ended up, they ended up losing their lives over. And we took all those names to the native area, and we had a fire with grandfather stones around them and contributed that to a really healing process for people. Just to have that acknowledged is extremely healing and nurturing for folks who are incarcerated. So that's Prisoners' Justice Day. I did mention earlier Circles of Support and Accountability, that's COSA. And support for immigrants and refugees, that's something that is getting more and more traction and discussion on the outside. Often there will be immigrants and refugees who are detained for a whole variety of reasons, some of them more on the criminal end and some of them more on the lack of documentation and such things. And then, of course, in this current climate, talking about what it means to be a country in which colonization really shaped our prison system. And finally, of course, with the passing of Bill C-16 in 2016, I believe, the prison system really had to grapple with a binary gender system in which men are incarcerated in a very different way than women are. And the question of how people who identify as trans would access and experience imprisonment was really on the table, and that's a conversation that's still going on. As I mentioned, Bath Institution has been identified in Ontario as the institution that addresses gender expression and gender identity, and at this time, trans folks are able to access what they need for health care, what they need for medications, what they need for hormones, but there's still a really long way to go in terms of raising awareness and knowledge in the prison system, both with incarcerated people and staff and management around the needs of trans folks. So the third section, just watching my time here, really addresses how Judaism shows up when we talk about folks who are incarcerated. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the ways in which Judaism is unique in that we can come together on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and really consider and ponder our actions, both collectively and individually. So this is a rabbi whose work I really love, Rabbi Tirsa Firestone. She just actually came out with a brand new book, Wounds to Wisdom, Healing Intergenerational Jewish Trauma. And she says, we carry within us tremendous riches as well as legacies of trauma and heartbreak. Let's come together to heal long-term wounds and harvest the best within us so that we can take action for personal and collective transformation at this critical moment in our world. And that really speaks to me and inspires me in terms of what I try to communicate in my one-on-one work and in my educational groups with Jewish incarcerated folks. So often it will be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that is the most obvious time that we can think about and consider how we want to restore a relationship. But I also use the holidays of Tu B'Shvat to welcome in our awareness of the trees and nature and our ecological footprint. Pesach to talk about liberation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and Eva did as well, to have seders in prison is one of the most amazing and fun and spirited experiences, because we're really talking about liberation. We're talking about a celebration and a festival that commemorates a move from the narrow place, from Mitzrayim, to a sense of freedom and newfound freedom, and what that means and what it looks like. So when the National Council has donated for the last 2 years foods for our Seders and for the week of Passover, it's really been a wonderful moment to share and discuss the ways that community plays a critical role in that kind of relationship transformation. And of course, Tisha B'Av, which is coming up next week, is also a time for deep reflection, for a time when we look at grief and loss and the ways in which grief and loss might inform our decisions. So for every incarcerated person, just being incarcerated is a massive experience of loss. It's a loss of connection to any positive relationships outside of the prison. It's a loss of a sense of belonging to society. There's much shame connected with it, and that sense of demotion, of failure, of being less than. And so Tisha B'Av is a time that I use to talk about that, to talk about how that shows up in the bodies of incarcerated people, and also how they might overcome that and find some resiliency tools or resources to help them overcome those feelings of isolation. In my Jewish study groups, we study Torah, we study Jewish life cycle events and philosophy, we do a little Talmud, and especially for Jews who are incarcerated and don't have a strong connection to Judaism, they absolutely love learning the Hebrew alphabet. It's something that they can study on their own and study with each other. It's just usually a one-page thing, and we have that beautiful repetition going on. And I really love in our groups the ways in which people build community with each other. And study is such a lovely way to do that. And of course, our tradition of pairs or Hefluta is really a way to bring people together to be resources for each other. In prison, folks are really encouraged not to build true relationship, and there's a lot of competition because of the conditions of incarceration. So I try to make my group sessions sacred spaces where relationships, again, can be modeled in different ways that have a much more transformative or restorative framework to them. Tahara, or the rituals around death, are very important for Jewish correctional chaplains because, as you can imagine, most prison management have no idea how to deal with a Jewish person who has died, who has passed. And there are definitely lifers who are incarcerated until they're very elderly, and sometimes they do die in prison. I did have a life-changing experience of arriving by chance at one of the prisons I work at on a day that one of my clients died. He had cancer. He had been in the hospital for months and then knew he was palliative and asked to go back to his mother institution to die there. And I did what I could to keep the environment sacred and safe and to practice the Jewish rituals around death. It was quite far from a city, so there were no Jewish resources available. But I worked with our regional chaplain and Benjamin Park Memorial, and they actually sent a truck and picked up his body and made sure that he was respectfully buried, and all of the pieces came into place. And I really learned how critical it is to have education before the fact, for security, for management at prisons, for the wardens, and also for chapel staff who tend not to be Jewish and not know the very detailed practices we have around death and dying. And then the last thing I wanted to share around this was that one of the most common tasks I have is to authorize Jewish diets. It is true that a lot of folks try to get the kosher diet who aren't Jewish. Unfortunately for the incarcerated Jews, the Jewish diet, the kosher diet, is not better in our federal system. It's probably worse in certain ways. But I do find myself in a position of authority in which I have to ask a number of questions and find out if the person across from me is legit kashrut, is really a kosher practicing Jew. So not one of my favorite aspects of the job, but I've definitely learned a lot doing that. So who is incarcerated as a Jew on the inside? I have met obviously every denomination and every culture, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ethiopian. I worked with a client who was part of the Kaifeng, the Chinese Jewish community. There's also many Messianic Jews. Some of us know them as Jews for Jesus. So these are folks who practice Judaism, who read Torah, who pray in Hebrew, but also believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And there's a number of folks like that in prison. And a community that I call Hebrew Israelite, but are really tribal Jews. They're often folks from the African diaspora who have a link or a connection to Israelite tradition. More than one person has come to me and said that passed down through generations, they know the tribe that they were associated with as Israelites. And of course, many folks in the Caribbean have mixed ancestry. So I've just learned a ton, and I could do a webinar on that specifically around the African diaspora and Judaism and how it shows up particularly in incarcerated communities. As I said earlier, almost everyone who has committed a crime has survived some kind of trauma. And in my work with Jews who are incarcerated, I've met every kind. Children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, Jews from the USSR who knew their ethnic connection but did not have any kind of heritage or cultural training, abuse survivors who have experienced sexual, physical, and psychological abuse, and also children of addicts. We have a myth in the Jewish community that our community doesn't struggle with addiction. That's completely untrue. And children of folks who struggle with addiction are often highly isolated. And there's a lot of shame with that. Also, most people across our country who are incarcerated are poor, working class. There's a few high profile who are kind of white collar and might come from money, but for the most part, we're looking at a community of folks who have made choices because of the poverty that they grew up in or live in. And as I mentioned, Jews of color, racialized Jews, because a disproportionate number of incarcerated people are racialized, are people of color, that shows up also in the Jewish communities that are incarcerated. And I've worked with more than one observant Jew who struggles with basically their sexual orientation and who have had a journey with that involving shame in which they end up sexually offending sometimes other Jews, sometimes children, sometimes non-Jews, but it's really a thing in our community and something that we shouldn't be afraid to address and hopefully heal. So what is it that we can discuss and share in Judaism that leads to some resilience? Well, one thing I love to do, because as you can imagine, prisons are very regimented in terms of time and schedule, is to invite Jewish time. To say what happens on a Friday night to a Saturday night is you get to rest because that's our tradition. And in resting, you get to heal. Let's watch the cycle of the moon. Let's be mindful of when Rosh Chodesh happens. And let's stay connected to seasons and festivals as a way to really lift up our spirit and build resilience. Also, Judaism, like many traditions, including many of the Eastern traditions, does not believe in dualisms, not good and bad, but an ethics, a framework in which all of us make mistakes and all of us can return. That's the true meaning of tshuva, returning. And we use tshuva in the process of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to build on accountability, to really create a community space where incarcerated folks can think about the harm they've caused, how they might want to move from that harm to healing, and what the necessary steps are to do that. There's a very beautiful Hasidic practice called hitbodedut, which I often encourage in my incarcerated groups. And this is a practice where we pray out. We pray out to trees, we pray out to the celestial bodies, we pray out of our bodies and really talk to God. And of course, Judaism has a hugely broad definition of who God is, what God is. And I really invite the folks that I work with to find God in themselves, to find the meaning of God in themselves, whether that be a relationship to nature, the awe that they may have experienced witnessing the birth of a child, or the profound relationships that have been meaningful for them. So Hitbodedut is really like a chanting and calling prayer practice that's specifically directed outwards towards nature. And it's a really wonderful antidote to what they experience inside the institution of prison or being inside their cell. I do love to talk about the concept of minyan, or as I mentioned earlier, chevruta. So these ways that Judaism welcomes and builds community. How can we be witnessed? How can we be accountable, but also be cared for? And what does it mean to come together and pray? When someone lives a life that is deeply isolated and alienated, spending time with others in prayer can be extremely nourishing and healing. So we work towards that as much as possible. In some of the institutions, there aren't 10 incarcerated Jews, so I would call that more of a chevruta or a chevruta circle. But I always identify what it means to come together and gather from within our cultural practice. And then the last piece is a practice called Musar, which also comes from the Hasidic tradition. It's essentially a beautiful framework for accepting and addressing values. And you go through a series of about 15 values over as many weeks, and you learn how to welcome them into your day. It's almost like mindfulness practices, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's something rare that I hadn't found in Judaism until I was going through the Kohenet ordination process. But incarcerated folks find it immensely helpful because it can move them through a process of understanding the violence and the harm that they've done and welcoming in new values, because it gives you the chance to literally practice every day with a focus on one specific value. So that's Musar. Just being mindful of the time, I'm going to move quickly through this last section, but you probably know tzedek, tzedek tirdof, this wonderful phrase that gets repeated in lots of different ways. Justice, justice shall we pursue. And it was actually in last week's Torah portion. But this is how we figure out what it means to be a Jew and carry our own accountability with us, to behave in ways that are aligned and attuned to our own values. And this is sort of what my goal is in working with incarcerated people, to bring them to that place over a period of time. So just to move quickly through the Al Chet prayer that we say on Yom Kippur is unique in that it uses the word we, for the wrongs we have done before you. And I really like to use this in prisons to encourage us to keep each other accountable and also release some of that shame that is such a common experience of incarcerated people around the harm they've done. Tashlich, which is that beautiful Rosh Hashanah practice where we release our so-called sins or wrongdoings into a body of water so that we can take it off our bodies. This is something that can be done in so many environments. Sometimes we'll use a bowl of water. I also encourage, if they want to, they can do it in their houses or their cells with a sink or even a toilet, just to say, these are the things that I'm releasing. Without releasing that sense of shame, there is no space to create healing and change. And Maimonides, our amazing Rambam, who was a medieval Egyptian, not only commentator, but profound Jewish scholar, came up with a very direct and specific framework for tshuva, for returning to our values. And it's called Hilchot Teshuvah. It's a full book, But it basically involves 4 steps. The first is confession. The second is remorse and becoming at one. The third is determination to improve. And the fourth is forgiveness by community. This is almost to a T what our restorative justice program suggests for incarcerated folks who are interested in moving through that kind of a framework. And I just love that our cultural tradition holds something so similar. Just because of time, I won't go into the detail of each step, but you can imagine taking a 4 or 5 week course with your correctional chaplain about each step and going through it with reflecting, using journals and conversations. So that's how we do it in these Jewish groups on the inside. And I believe this is, my last slide. So just to wrap up, I also love to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we didn't use prison as a framework for punishment in Torah. So what was there instead? Well, there was this sense of obligation. In the book of Exodus, we have an example of what's called the Eved Ivri, which is a person who's obligated to serve for 6 years after they've caused harm. And in the 7th year, they're liberated. But they're doing service. They're not isolated. In fact, they're brought into community. And this is such a beautiful way to consider not only how long it takes for a human being to really sit with profound violence that they've done and experienced, but also how to call someone in, as we like to say in transformative justice movements, call someone in and trust that they have the capacity to make better choices. And the other piece that we find in the book of Numbers is the Ir Hamiklat, the city of refuge, which Moses instructed to create in the land of Israel. And these are 6 cities that were so abundant that they allowed for people who had committed murder to come in and live without tapping into the resources of the community. So in the instances where someone was no longer trusted and they had really released the ability to be in community, they weren't abandoned. They were invited to a place of abundance. And I love to think of this in counterpoint to what the prisons are, which are spaces of scarcity. This idea of a city of refuge has come up throughout not only Jewish theology, but also Christian theology in welcoming someone who has harmed as someone who's lacking, who's limited, and who needs care. And so I wanted to finish my presentation with that. Not seeing you in person, I'm not sure how it's landing. I'd love to answer some questions. If this feels like it's way off the radar, that's great. Let me know what you think. If this feels really aligned and makes sense to some of the work that you're doing, I would love to know that as well. So I'm going to have a look at the questions, unless Bonnie or Eva, you think I should do otherwise. I'll just have a look at them. We've got 4, so that's great. And my wonderful mentor and professor is here, Nazila. Hi, Nazila. So good to see you here. You're wondering how ethnic and cultural communities can support inmates during COVID-19. Such an amazing question. There's now a huge divide between us as faith-specific, what's called tradition-specific correctional chaplains, and the site chaplains. So the ones who are in the prisons proper are back at work, and they do a lot of the administrative work. But those of us who are working with specific faith traditions are not in the prisons, and we're down to a 20% workload. So Muslim chaplains, Buddhist chaplains, Jewish chaplains, Sikh chaplains, all of us are at home, working from home, trying to support the folks on the inside. And what can be very helpful for ethnic and cultural communities is to receive us and make suggestions. Like, what National Council offered this year for Passover was wonderful. So I was able to arrange with the warden to receive these packages of Passover food, but I myself couldn't go to deliver them. So it really involves a lot of relationship building and a lot more steps in between. We have been pushing, like you wouldn't believe, to try to get some technology on board so we could do services, for example, over video with the people we work with. None of that has been happening, and we're all quite frustrated with it. But ethnic and cultural communities can write letters, can say how important it is that their specific group, whether it be, in your case, Nazila Muslims or Jews or anyone, Buddhists, that they should be able to see their chaplain, have community, have contact with their chaplain. So maybe stick around after, and I can actually share we have a form letter that we've been asking faith communities to send in, and I'm really happy to share that with anyone who's interested. Oh, I see how, okay, Bonnie, are you managing the questions? Because I see how Nazila's has now gone. Yeah.
Well, did you want me to read them to you? I'm just ticking them off so that you can see them better.
Oh, perfect. No, I can see them right here.
So as you answer them, I'll remove them so you know
Perfect.
what you've already answered.
Oh, that's so helpful. Thank you. Shirley Katz, I don't think we're related, is saying Jews from only about 1% form only about 1% of the Canadian population, and yet your figures show that they represent 1 to 2% of the inmates. Can you explain that? Thank you for doing that math. I've never done that math, and I really don't have an explanation for it. If only to say that and this is anecdotal, don't quote me on it, but as I was saying, I have met a lot more racialized Jews and certainly Messianic Jews inside than I've met in community. And they would account for, statistically being Jews. They're not rabbinic Jews, and I'm working actually with our national chaplaincy office to try to create 3 categories. I do think it's important to differentiate between rabbinic Jews and Messianic Jews and tribal Jews, although I think it's great if we all learn together. So that could have something to do with it. I'd love to know anyone else's thoughts on why there's that discrepancy. It's not a huge discrepancy. There's a much bigger discrepancy for Indigenous and Black folks between the percentage in the Canadian population and how many folks are incarcerated. Anonymous attendee is asking, do Jewish inmates have to prove their Jewish birth and or identity before you help them? If so, what's the process? Great question. Thank you for asking it. So in our provincial system, there was a human rights complaint around specifically Jewish inmates having to prove their lineage and heritage, and it was determined that they shouldn't have to. So the provincial system has had a huge spike in requests for kosher diet, and they basically have to give them. Then what happens is for folks who come to the federal system, they then have to meet with the Jewish chaplain, whether it's myself or someone else in a different institution, and there is a requirement that they prove their Jewish birth. I tend to take a different approach to that, which is that I meet with the inmate 3 times and I really determine what's going on for them. For those who are connected to Jewish community and who have been raised Jewish and practice it their whole lives, there's no question, it's very obvious to me. But I also believe for folks who are just finding their Judaism or who are not Jewish but curious about it, they should have a right to learn about it on the inside. So I work with the system in ways that I can to sort of create a circle that feels welcoming instead of a circle that feels like they're going to be policed in some way around their identity. I also, as a Jewish renewal person, really do see patrilineal and matrilineal descent as valid, and I've worked with various correctional chaplains from different denominations that feel similarly or differently, but at this point, even the conservative responsa to the question of lineage includes patrilineage. So not sure if that was part of your question, but I wanted to throw that in there. Debbie Wasserman, how do Orthodox men relate to a woman and your advice? Awesome question. I've had both and there. I've worked with a couple observant guys, Orthodox guys, who really were not interested in working with me as a woman, and a number of Orthodox guys who are great with it. I don't think they necessarily see me in the same authoritative framework as they might an Orthodox man or a rabbi, but they were really invested in praying with me. They loved hearing my perspective, and I have worked with a sexual offender who came into Orthodoxy, who's more Baal Tshuva, who really wanted to talk to me specifically because I'm more of a liberal Jew, because he had questions around gender and sexuality and didn't feel like he could bring that to his Orthodox rabbi. So it's been a really interesting mix, and I'll add into that the Jewish representative on the Interfaith Committee, which is Correction Services Canada advisory board for chaplaincy, is a very frum rabbi from Montreal, and we work really well together. He's been amazingly supportive and helpful, and in the times when we disagree, he's been respectful. I've really learned a lot about some of my own prejudices against Orthodox communities in this work, and it's really transformed me. Suzanne Jacobson, missed the beginning. How many prisons do you visit? So I visit 3 prisons and 7 different, 3 institutions and 7 different prisons, because in the 3 institutions there's different levels of security. Phyllis Taylor. I don't know if this is my beloved mentor, Phyllis Taylor, who lives in Philadelphia, but if it's you, I'm so happy to see you here. Yes, it is you, obviously, because now I'm reading your question. I'm so impressed with you. I too work in the prison system as a motivational speaker. My question is, will this be posted somewhere? We did discuss this, and I have to say I'm guilty of not asking my regional chaplain yet, but I have to find out if there's any security risks with posting this talk. I think that they might prefer I don't, but what can we say? We'll let folks know who registered? What would be appropriate?
Well, my feeling is, or that we'd like to hear from you first.
Right.
And then maybe whether it's specific, I don't think we'd be posting it, on Facebook or the social media. So I think we'll have to evaluate how to do that. So we'd gladly be in touch with Phyllis. Yeah.
Yeah, I can let you know too. So happy you're here, Phyllis. Another question, are the incarcerated really devout or mostly don't care? Full gamut, and I've worked with so many people who come to a devout practice because they're incarcerated, because they're desperate, because they're longing for some connection, because they miss culture. They didn't realize how important it was to them until they got out of it. It's really incredible. Everyone's individual, and I would also say that for folks who do struggle with mental illness and severe mental illness, their religious practice really, really matters to them, because they feel often like it's the only place they're not being judged. And there is a lot of stigma, much just like in regular society, there's a lot of stigma against folks who have visible struggles around mental illness. I'm seeing my cousin there just after this next question. So Gail Crystal, how so interesting. Does this support help previously unaffiliated Jews continue in their Judaism after they are released? 100%. Are there any specific programs for them when they leave prison? Great question. So absolutely, I've worked with a number of people who want to continue practicing as Jews, having come to it in prison. And part of my work, and it's one good thing about COVID, is I've been able to develop this a bit more, is to connect them specifically with synagogues. And I'm now working with 5 or 6 synagogues in Southern Ontario, all of whom are very supportive of connecting with formerly incarcerated people. They're non-judgmental, and the community is open to it. In one in particular, here in Toronto, at Temple Emmanuel, they actually have someone who is a former correctional officer who is a member, and she's really interested in inviting folks over for Shabbat and building relationship and inviting them to other synagogue events. So yeah, absolutely. One of the great organizations here in the city is Via Havta. I'm sure lots of folks know about it. They work on all kinds of levels and are very welcoming, and really like working with volunteers who are formerly incarcerated, and they have a program called Via Havta Academy, which helps upgrade folks in terms of employment and schooling and things like that. Roz, fine, my cousin. Hi, nice to see you here. And you know me as Rena. And what does Orev mean in front of your name? It's a crossover question with family. So Orev is my priestess name. It came to me as part of my priestess ordination process. And it does mean raven or crow. In Torah, there's no differentiation between ravens and crows, but they are tricksters, similar to a lot of indigenous cosmology. And apparently, Noah sent out an orev, a raven or a crow, before the dove. So the bird that didn't find the olive branch was actually an orev, or a raven or a crow, and they're understood to be a bird that seeks but doesn't find. And the root, the shoresh of the word, is similar to erev. It's the same shoresh, like evening or mixing, in between space. So hope that answers your question, Roz. We can talk about it another time too. Jill Garazi. Do the inmates get bullied for getting special treatment for kosher meals, holiday traditions, etc.? I wouldn't say bullied so much as noticed. There's definitely a social culture in which any extra anything gets sort of noted and tallied, but there is a profound respect for spiritual practice. Having said that, I'm not going to pretend that, you know, there aren't people who try to get the kosher diet so they can trade for stuff that they want with other inmates. That happens. That's a reality of prison life. But it's, and I'm not going to pretend there isn't anti-Semitism, because there are, and there is, and there's sometimes the benefits, the perceived benefits that Jews get are used towards calling out or being anti-Semitic in some way. But I wouldn't say that there's a bullying happening because it's special treatment. So I hope that distinction is clear. And also Jill is asking, do you find that the Jewish inmates stick together gang-like or get persuaded to join other gangs? So I will say it's not that there isn't gang culture in prisons. There is. I would not say that that's the pervasive experience for all incarcerated people, especially those who are participating in things like chapel, or who are doing programming or school. They're living a life that's very similar to other people in our society and outside the prison culture who are, you know, involved with social services in some way. Jewish inmates tend to stick together in the ways that we do in society, in that we like to be together, we like to do things together, we have some things that we can relate to each other on, and we help each other learn and grow. But there's also, I definitely work with a number of Jewish inmates who don't have an interest in any friendships. A lot of folks try to, what's called, do their time, you know, be connected only to themselves and do exactly what's expected of them and get out as soon as they can. And I've certainly worked with the full range. And then our last question, is there overt anti-Semitism among prisoners and guards? There is definitely overt anti-Semitism, and more than I have witnessed in an urban center like Toronto. My experience is the anti-Semitism gets more intense in the institutions in smaller towns, right, where most of the staff have never met a Jew. Those are cultures and environments where things like kosher diet feels really foreign to people, where they might have an idea of a Jew as like being just, you know, a Hasidic man who's swarthy or any number of other stereotypes. And there's a kind of mockery around that. And then there's a fair bit of ignorance that one might think of as well-intentioned, that Jews experience as anti-Semitism because it's harmful to us. The level of ignorance can be really high. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's all our questions. We have a few more minutes if anyone wants to put anything up there, but other than that, I just want to offer my gratitude. It's been really wonderful to have the opportunity to do your inaugural webinar. And Eva and Bonnie, it's so wonderful to work with you both. I hope that this presentation has been informative, and my contact information is on that last slide. I'll just share my screen again real quick to give you my contact information, and please feel free to email me or get in touch. And thank you to Anonymous, who says a fantastic and informative talk. Thank you.
Great, and I will echo that as an understatement. Orev, this has been fabulous, so eye-opening, so informative, and you know, your presentation with your pure honesty and, you know, traveling this route, I think it'll take us a while to sort of digest everything that you've said, that you've done, and for many of us, a whole 360 on our perception of the world we've not explored or touched, and the incarcerated. So just so many things to rethink. So I cannot thank you enough for sharing with us. And for us at National Council, that, you know, the fact that, as you know, that we're doing our work to try to make lives of women who have been experienced abuse, whether it's, you know, domestic violence or, you know, violence, gendered violence, that this adds a whole other perspective, in that not only do we want to address the issue and make sure that they're safe, but how do we create an environment where it doesn't happen? And so you've brought up a really important look at these potential perpetrators and what is our role in addressing our issues, that this becomes an important part of, if we really want to solve this problem, it is a duality between both. And so you've opened up, you know, many channels of our, again, our possible working together and our communication. And so I thank you, you know, on behalf of what our future together can look like. And again, also just for opening our eyes to what is justice and what are human rights. And it's something that we've, again, been advocating for our 123 years, and you are making us relook at that. And I just have to say that that I feel these inmates are so lucky to have you. Your gentleness and your compassion is just so beautiful. So I'm so glad that our Jewish inmates have you as a mentor and as a guide. And on that note, thank you everyone for participating, for coming, for asking your questions. And I know that this dialogue will keep going. And I hope you all come to our future webinars where we explore what the Jewish life that we lead and how we can just keep opening it and making it better and tikkun olam. So Arev, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you. A good night to all and Shabbat Shalom.